Sarah Saeed, welcome back to Highest Aspirations. I think it's been like 3 years.
It has, and I've been part of starting the school and really building that up. So I've been pretty busy, but I'm glad to be back and be here with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you. It's been quite a journey, and the great thing about it is that there's our colleague, I'll mention her, Ari, mentioned some of the great things that you were doing, and she said you should reach out because she's interested in chatting about them, and this is obviously a great venue to do that. So the hope here is that a lot of the things that you talk about, just like last time, other folks can kind of think about them and get started in doing the work that you all are doing there. So that being said, a lot of this conversation is going to revolve around amplifying the voices of multilingual learners and their families so that they have a greater control, more agency around their education. And I want to just kind of ground ourselves by talking about why you feel like this is such a crucial need in this moment and in general. Obviously, this moment is a unique one as we kind of come back from a year and a half of just madness in education in a lot of other places. So why is it so important, and why specifically now do you think it's so crucial?
I think because we really need to, we've always needed to allow our students to be leaders in their own learning and really be in the driver's seat when it comes to that. I think, this pandemic has been difficult, but let's look at it from a positive angle and look at it as an opportunity to dismantle and restructure our systems and how we really look at learning. And a lot of times the student voice isn't brought in because, especially with multilingual learners, they're still gaining their proficiency in English. And, the general thought of teachers is, well, they struggle with language. Why would I bring their voice in? But that's where you can find multiple angles and multiple ways to bring a student's voice in, even if you don't speak the language.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really an interesting concern. I was just talking with somebody about this earlier today. How are we going to bring voice in when language is, a challenge or a barrier that people call it? And we know that it's not a barrier, it's an asset, and it's something that we can bring in. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And I like what you said also about, it has been a hard year and a half or so, but there's also been these moments of, I think, clarity and learning that we can kind of bring forward as we go through this next school year, which I think will be an exciting one. So we're grounded in kind of the why, and I think that's important. The logistics is another thing that kind of scares people away from these kinds of things. So like a lot of the stuff that you're talking about means you're having one-on-one conferences with students, right?
Yes.
You're spending the time to really allocate time to give them an opportunity to talk about their learning, their goals, their challenges. So logistically, how do you go about allocating the time to do that? Because that's always like the biggest challenge. I don't have the time or the logistics to do that. And how do you structure the conferences? So start with like the timing, and then sort of how the structure goes when you actually do these.
So the timing, being an EL education school and using the EL education K-5 ELA curriculum, we kind of have that timing built in already. We have 2 blocks for ELA, and at the lower grades, it's what you would call our module, or it's our general content literacy. And then there's also a chunk of time called the skills block, which is structural phonics, and that's rotations. So what we do in the first few weeks of school with the younger ones is during those rotations, we push in and we become a rotation. And that's where the conferences are handled. With the older kids, we call it the L block, the All Language Literacy Block. That's what the acronym stands for. And during that all block, so that second block of literacy time, that is the time where at the beginning of the year, while it's always the grind in the world of multilingual, right? You're learning the data, you're starting to understand that. That's where we do our first conference. And so we get to know the way it's structured. So at the beginning of the year, we're really getting to know our students. And right. So that's where we get to know them. We try to do it after students take the NWEA ELA and math assessment. And so that's where we start talking to them about, how do you think you did? Where are your strengths? And what work do we need to do? So we look at those areas on the NWEA MAP assessment, but then we also look at the WIDA assessment. And with the WIDA assessments, we look at the 4 domains of language. And so from looking at both sets of data, that's where we turn to our students and say, okay, which domain do you think you want to really focus on during this part of the year? And, they look at their data, they look at the can-do descriptors. And so if there are 3, they look at what you need to become a 4. And in those descriptors, they use that, and we work together to formulate a sentence. So if a student is struggling with coming up with that sentence, that's where we may utilize a sentence stem to help them. And, it's a conversation of, okay, what do we do in all block? Well, we know we do language dives. We know we do writing. And so also we wait till the routine is established in there so they know what the routine is.
Right.
So really it's like the 3rd week of school, I would say, that we set the first goal, just so that they've had their feet wet and they know the structure of all in skills block. And that's during the time where we, again, we have that conversation, we create that goal together. By the second time, it's more student driven. So the first time it's more like modeled, but we create that goal together. And then when the winter comes along, we come back to that goal. And we look at that goal through a couple different lenses. There's a celebration of learning, which we'll talk about later. But also we look at that goal in their progress on, again, map assessment, because we do it again in the winter. We also look at the different standards. We are standards-based grading. So we look at the different Common Core standards and how they match up with the WIDA standards. And we have a conversation about the domains and where their growth was. And then during our celebrations of learning and their their student-led conferences, student-led parent-teacher conferences, they actually discuss their progress with their parents as well. So, and we have those goals established. We keep them, if we want to get technical, we're going to be working with keeping them in elevation this year. In the past, we kept them in spreadsheets. Now that our program is bigger, we're actually going to be doing them in meetings on elevation. Right.
Yeah. And that's great to hear, obviously being from elevation, but I want to come back to that, but I want to backtrack a little bit. You're using, in terms of logistics and time, you're using the time that's kind of already afforded to you. This isn't like a special thing. Like most districts and most teachers do have access to these. It's just a matter of, it sounds like kind of, I don't know if it's retrofitting in your case, but in many situations, it might be retrofitting the time and thinking about, okay, how can we best serve these students during this time so that we're able to chat with them and first of all, start to build a relationship. And what a great opportunity to start building that relationship. And you said, like, by the 3rd week, then you're really getting into the kind of the nitty gritty and thinking about assessments and whatever data that you have available to you. So I think like there's 2 pieces there that you just brought up that I think are important takeaways. One is determine the right time to be able to do this so that you're not going crazy and so that you're not, taking something else away, right? And 2, think about how the structure is going to go in terms of the data that you're looking at. And I want to dive in a little bit more into that. You said, you use the WIDA data, the can-do descriptors, which with anybody who's working in a WIDA state is familiar with, as well as MAP. It sounded like assessments that you're using as well.
Yeah.
What, in terms of like, put me in the situation where you're sitting like next to a student. Like, what do you have in front of you? And how do you get that student to really kind of like internalize the data and make it more than just a test score and make it more than something that you got this, but rather something where here's where you are now and here's where you can go. Talk about that a little bit, because I think that's the magic, right?
Yeah. And in our school, we are a portfolio school. So if they're a 5th grader, we're in year 4 as a school. We have their portfolios from 2nd grade.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So we can flip through them and we can look at them and we can have a conversation about the growth. I have their map data from when they were 2nd grade all the way to, and I have it graphed all the way to, 5th grade. So it's a bunch of different pieces of artifacts, and even looking at the quality of the writing and the, quality of the conversation, even talking about anecdotal, when you were in 2nd grade, you really struggled with formulating sentences while you were speaking. Now you're speaking in front of your classroom and presenting in front of your classmates. Like, because we know them so well, those are the conversations we have. Now, when it's a student I don't know, that's when I start asking them questions about their schooling history. What was your classroom like? What was your teacher like? How do you like to learn? What are some things that I can do to support you? And even when I do know them, I ask the same question: what can I do to support you? Like, where do you think I fit in? And to be honest, they usually have some really good answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They know themselves as learners. Yeah.
Yes, they look at themselves as learners. And, I'm in a really unique role where I service and support students and co-teach in the upper grades, but I'm also the program director. So I can look at it from 500 feet and I can look at it from 10,000 feet. And what I can say is we have seen growth on, like, when I look at the MAP scores, we have seen growth on the MAP scores in terms of that are at benchmark, and also meeting their growth targets. And I think it's because when a student can see the target and they know where they need to go, and you're actually having an explicit conversation about that, they have that mindset. Well, yeah, I remember I really need to focus on this because Miss Saeed and I talked about how I could really work on making clear sentences and in those language dives, and it really does filter into everything else.
Yeah. And what I like about what you're saying here is that it seems to be a combination, and I can sort of picture, because I remember the exact place that I'd have these conferences and the students would have this work in front of them, and I'd have some data that was more like quantitative, and you have a lot of artifacts to look at. So while I may be looking at sort of whether it was formative or summative assessment data, or whatever the case may be, the student often was showing me artifacts from the portfolios that you had mentioned. So, from the student perspective, I guess my question is, what typically are they showing you? What parameters do they have? I mean, I imagine it's a structure and agency kind of thing. It can't be just totally wide open. You can show me whatever you want. You have this portfolio. There has to be some structure there, but there's also got to be agency. So what are they showing you to kind of inform you of their path and their learning and their path forward?
I mean, in the portfolio, it's a very, we narrowed it down to things that kids need to have because they would put everything in there. So we have like the major pieces of writing. And I mean, what's nice about the ELA curriculum is each quarter, they take time to go draft by draft to work on one piece that is high quality. And so we look at those high quality pieces from each quarter, and that's the discussion we have. So if we're in like second or third quarter, we're looking at what they did first quarter, and that piece of writing. Like in our third grade class, they usually write like they write about like their own literacy, and so like we have that piece and their own reading difficulties. We have that piece, and we talk about that, and we have a conversation about it, and that's what leads the conversation.
Logistical question, because I think it's important. It's coming to my mind as I'm thinking about how you go about doing this. And a lot of it is the conversation but it's all, there's also like, you talked about you were using Elevation in the meeting center to kind of to document some of this information and to have it down. I'd love to know, not only with Elevation tools, but anything else, how are you kind of organizing all this information? Because it's not only you who's holding on to it, it's the student as well. And I could see that being a bit of a nightmare with like manila folders or Chromebooks everywhere. I mean, how are you putting that information together in a way that both you and the student can understand it?
We were pretty much putting them in like really condensed sentences, like I can statements. So they could remember this was their I can goal. And I had them typed out and given to them with learning targets. And then they were learning targets. And then I held on to them as well in a spreadsheet, so that I had that documented after each meeting. That was prior to having Elevation. With Elevation, like I said, they still have that target, but it's in the meeting notes. And then of course you can send the notes to people. So like that goes to the parents, that goes to the teacher so that they can have them.
Yeah. So you have all
Right.
stakeholders involved digitally and in a way that you can keep it organized. Yeah, because I
Yeah.
just remember like when I was, this was years ago, and I had students, I actually gave students the option as to whether, because some the way that it worked is some of my students had iPads, but some of my students issued by the school, but some of them didn't. So I'd say, your portfolio can be digital or it can be, you can create it yourself. And it got to be,
Yeah, we are 1-to-1.
yeah.
So,
And most are
but we
now.
do have it. Yeah, most schools are. We also use Seesaw.
Yep.
So we can easily, we're a big Seesaw school, so we can easily open up their Seesaw account and see what's in there as well, with them on Chromebooks. And then we have paper binders as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, I just thinking back to like that's something that I can struggle with, is just the overwhelming amount of stuff. So you have to have kind of a place and a system in place before you start. I speak from experience because it can get overwhelming pretty soon. But if you have
It
something like
can.
Seesaw, your 1-to-1 and Elevation, you're definitely in good shape.
Oh, we are. Like I said, there's a lot of positive that's come from this pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully that's not, that we won't go back to the way it was. That's like one of my biggest fears and concerns, is that we go back to that.
Oh, not us.
Yeah. I don't know. I get the impression that that's not the case. All right. So sticking with these 1-to-1 meetings, we've spent a lot of time on this. We think it's really like talking about the structure and the logistics of it is important. What would you consider a successful outcome to one of those meetings? Like you've just left, you're sort of thinking about it and processing and reflecting. What's a successful outcome?
I've done less talking.
I love it. Yeah.
The student's done most of the talking. The student has been able to look at the can-do descriptors and say, hey, this is where, and in a thoughtful way, this is where I really have work to do, and this is where I am, and this is where I want to be. And this is how I'm going to get there.
And this is how I'm going to get there. Yeah. Yeah. Did they respond? Because I love the can-do descriptors in that they're asset-based. They give you something to shoot for. Does it take time for you to kind of acquaint the students with them and the language and how it kind of works? Or is it, I see you nodding your head.
I'm trying to remember the name of the teacher. His last name is Culbertson. He's well known on Twitter. He actually wrote student-friendly can-do descriptors.
Oh, I love that.
Those are the ones I use. I don't want to take credit for that. Those are his. He's in Michigan. He's actually shared them on Twitter. And so those are the ones I use. And especially with the little ones, the kindergartners, we only look at listening and speaking in the beginning, just because they're still learning how to formulate sounds, and all the data we really have is for listening and speaking anyway. And we wait until we get some better reading data from some of their benchmarks, because they also do EL education benchmarks in order to kind of acquaint them more with the reading goals. And then with the older kids, I would say now, because some of them have done it, they know where to go. And I was even doing it on Seesaw last year, where I actually plugged in those student-friendly can-dos. And I had them kind of go into Seesaw, read them, and like kind of circle the ones they thought were most important and write it down first before they met with me.
Yeah. You just brought up something that's really important, and that's the idea of sort of crowdsourcing information, and the natural sort of ability of you to find information, and the great sharing that happens in professional learning communities. And you and I have talked about that before in the past, and how great is it that you have a teacher from Michigan who's putting out these amazing resources that you're accrediting and that you're using. That's awesome. Yeah, because it can be a little heady. It can be a little academic, right? The language. It's designed for teachers, so it makes sense. So I think that was kind of the foundation of my question, is how do the students that are, some of them in elementary school, how do they go about processing them? And that's a great way to do it. So earlier you mentioned, and you said we'd get into it, we're going to now, those multilingual celebrations of learning. I think that that's so crucially important, maybe now more than ever, as we really focus on, the asset-based nature of learning, as we focus on social emotional learning, inspiring confidence in students after what has been for many students a very traumatic year and a half. So I don't know if I hit on any of the things that the purposes that you are hoping to accomplish with those multilingual celebrations of learning, but talk about us and talk with those about us. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with my words this afternoon. I've done 2 of these today in my defense. And sometimes
Okay.
when I do 2 in a day, my language skills are not as good as they normally are. I'm sure
Yes.
listeners will forgive. So let me try that again. Talk with us about those celebrations and the purpose that they serve.
It's really to allow students to be able to talk about the authenticity and craftsmanship of their high quality work. And so, again, being
Authenticity and craftsmanship. I love that.
yes,
Sorry,
but
go
that
ahead.
doesn't come from me. That comes from EL education. I can't take that credit. And so in the world of EL education, they really think about, and this is Ron Berger, if people follow him on Twitter, talking about the idea that when children, grow up and they're done with school and they enter the workplace, that people will look at them by the quality of their work and their character. And so by the quality of work, it's really getting kids to work to create those high quality pieces and multilingual. So we have celebrations of learning all across the board. So every class has one. Sometimes we teachers invite parents. During the pandemic, they did it more digitally, but I think we're going to move back to having parents in the building, I hope.
I hope so too.
But then we do our own in the multilingual department because it's more of a comfort thing, right? With multilingual families and multilingual students, where multilingual students can feel free to be able to give those same presentations, but in their native language, so that they can communicate with their parents about the quality of their work. So what I usually have students do, and I have a display where we'll have the piece that the student is, whether it's a piece of writing, and sometimes with the little kids it's writing and art,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be something they've built. They have that there, like in a space, think of like an art gallery space, and the student standing, or science fair type, set up, the student standing there. But I also have their goal there, but it's written in a way where, like, if other parents see it, we're not violating any type of confidentiality. So their goals there as well. It's there in English and it's there in the native language, which I do my best with Google Translate. I'm not literate in every language. I'm only literate in 3. So,
I wouldn't say only. That's pretty good.
I do my best, but sometimes, like, some of my Polish speaking parents are like, yeah, that's not what that says. And I'm like, okay.
Help me out then. Yeah.
I tried, but just really thinking about it, even though it's not correct, there's still that comfort that we tried and our parents appreciate it.
Right.
And so the kids have that conversation about their learning and what has been going on in their classroom with their parents. But it's not, we do student-led conferences too, but this is a little different because they're only talking about one piece. And it's really something that they are proud of and they present. So that's really what a multilingual celebration learning is. And they present to other parents as well. And it's just a really comfortable space.
Yeah. It sounds very intentional. And you've said the word comfortable many, many times. And I know that you've said that deliberately because that's important. The last thing you want to do is create, discomfort from something that the student should be really confident about. And I think I think you do a good job. It sounds like kind of getting right at that zone of proximal development, that productive struggle, right? Where you're just at the point where you're learning, but you're not totally overwhelmed. I think that's great. And it's such a key tenet in any part of education. So, when we first talked, and we were talking a little bit before we clicked record on this episode, I had to ask you, I had to put on our questions a question about scalability. And you had asked me, well, what do you mean by scalability? And it was a really good question because I was looking at this as the point of view of, I was the teacher who wanted to do things like this. And I would have these conferences with my students and I was doing portfolios, but I was the only one, right? Like I was doing it kind of in a silo. And then maybe another teacher would be interested in knowing what I was doing, would work together, would do different things. I didn't work in a school like yours. So I know that in your school, this is kind of part of the culture, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's part of the mission. It's part of what you do. So I'm maybe asking you a bit of an unfair question, but I'd love for you to give your perspective on what does it take to make this something that everybody in the school is doing, and it's not just something that's happening in these little silos.
Okay, well, this change takes time, right? And it can happen overnight, and you can't be discouraged if you feel like you are in your own silo. It's kind of like, have you ever seen that video of the silly dancer? And then somebody else looks at the silly dancer and then they start dancing the same way. And then eventually you have a crowd of silly dancers.
I've not
It's
seen it. Sounds like something I need to see.
it's kind of like setting up that culture where, I mean, from the administrative perspective, it's easier to set that culture, right? But I want to also think about the teachers that are listening to this. From the teacher's perspective, I think if you do it in your classroom and you really put it out there that you're doing that, and you even allow teachers to observe you and allow, you really make yourself vulnerable and open to that. I think that you're going to have more silly dancers following you.
Yeah. Yeah.
From the administrative perspective, it's really, working with, your core group of teachers, maybe your school improvement team or we have instructional leadership team, and really talking in your culture about how do you implement that, and really working with teachers to get their voice on how they want to implement that, and understand that as well.
Yeah. And you bring up I think you kind of alluded to something that I was thinking about here too, is that there are always teachers who are interested in sharing their expertise and becoming teacher leaders. I was one of those people, and those opportunities unfortunately don't always exist in kind of an official capacity, right? So as a school administrator, how do you go about leveraging a teacher who is doing something that is successful, even if it's anecdotally successful, right? And getting them to share that information with others, which is something that you're doing on this podcast, just with a greater audience, right? But like, I think that's a great way to go about doing it. Would you agree?
Yes, and it depends on the comfort level of the teacher. Some teachers want to put themselves out there, some get scared. And it's really, I think, when you have that person who is that quiet person that's doing so many good things in their classroom, and you're like, I really want to showcase you. And they're like, I don't know. I don't want to be that one. They don't want to be that one. It's really working first with them and taking the time to work with them to build their confidence, whether it be starting slowly with them, to have them send an email, to, continuing to move about it. We're continuing to move with them to get them to present at a staff development, like having that type of staff. We've had staff developments where we try to work with different teachers, so it's not just the same people. We try to work with different teachers to present on what they're doing in their classroom. We try to do like gallery walks too with our staff on
Yep.
different topics. And okay, well, this, everybody's got theirs on the gallery walk. You can go look at it and respond quietly or talk to that person later. So it depends on your school climate and environments.
Yeah, and you just mentioned gallery walks, which to me is like a great sort of passive way of celebrating a teacher who may not be like front and center wanting to, because
Yeah.
you're right. And I didn't mention that, and I'm glad you did. Like, not every teacher who's doing great and amazing things is the person who wants to be, leading a session.
Or
But
wants to be on Twitter.
right. But building the confidence so that they might be able to do that in some way, even if it's just a gallery walk or more passive way, because there's just so much knowledge to be gained by that. And the more we can do it, I think the better, particularly when we start to talk about some of the really interesting things that you all are doing with conferencing and with portfolio work. So one more kind of specific question about this, particularly with the WIDA standards, before we get into some questions that I like to ask everybody. You've aligned a lot of the goal setting with the WIDA standards, with can-do descriptors. You're using a lot of the goals. You're using elevation to document that all, which I think is all great. The standards are changing this year. And so I'm curious, I haven't really talked with a lot of people. This is fairly new, but how do you plan on sort of incorporating that during this transition year? I mean, a lot of people are asking about that. I don't think anybody's really super worried, but they're just like, all right, well, what do we do now? Because things are changing, but the test hasn't changed. So where are we with that?
You know what? I see. I'm still learning that too. I'm maintaining the same can-do descriptors that I've used because I've gotten the guidance that the can-dos are not changing much. It's
Hmm.
more of the key language uses. So now I need to think about, well, how do I incorporate those key language uses better along with the can-dos because I was only incorporating the can-dos before.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I think your approach is right. I think people tend to get a little panicky and, and worry about, change before it happens. But I think this is like I said, a transition year, and I've seen that before with other like taught AP courses. When the rubrics change, there's always this big like, oh, what's going to happen? But then typically the change kind of evolves over time, and there's time to kind of to bring it in when you need to. And I don't think that we need to worry about anything else, if possible, as we go back to school this year. There's enough on our plates for sure. But I wanted to make sure I asked because I didn't know if you had any other guidance there. Okay, so question that I like to ask everybody, and I probably asked you this 3 years ago, and I don't remember what you said, and I don't know if you do either. But at this point, 3 years later, in the second episode that you're doing with us, is there a book or a film or any other resource that has had an important influence on you, either personally or professionally, that you'd like to share?
Lately, I've been reading the book The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris. And the reason why I've been reading that and really trying to like internalize that and understand it is, we're in a time where we have experienced collective trauma and we're trying to move forward from that collective trauma. And, we think about it as adults, but now we need to think about how that collective trauma affects kids and their growth and development. And so that book, Nadine, she really like lays it out on how, as a doctor, she's treated kids that have come from extreme trauma and how it's affected their physical growth and their academic development as well. So in thinking about, well, how can we utilize her study to help us right now? As we have kids that were fully remote last year, and how do we help them acclimate? And some of them have seen things that, from being home all the time that they wouldn't normally see. So just
Yeah,
really just trying to dig to the core of that.
that's a great recommendation. I think totally apropos. Not a book that I've read, but now adding to my list,
It's
which I
on
say,
Audible. I've been listening to it too. It's on Audible.
yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, listening either. Great. Okay, I appreciate that. And then last question, Sarah, how can people learn more about the work you're doing? I know you're active on social and lots of other places. How can people learn more about you?
A couple ways. So Twitter, my Twitter handle is at MRS SAID. So Mrs. Said 17. And also, so I've been doing this project with my team called the Stand Up Stumps. And we have it on our school. So if you go to our school website, www.elginmathandscience.com, you could see the Stand Up Stumps project we've been doing and some of our latest work with our JEDI frameworks, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion that we've been doing as well.
Yeah, check that out. And if people are wondering more about that, Sarah, you and I talked before we clicked record, that this is probably just one of a two-parter that we'll do, because there's some really amazing work happening with those two projects. And I encourage people to check that out. And I'm hoping that we can find time in the next couple of months to bring you on again and talk about that, because that's a key component of what we need to do with these students. But for today, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about something that I feel like, frankly, we could do better. And that is give students the agency over their own learning and allow them to really set goals, track those goals, and figure out where they were, because or where they're going and where they want to go. That's what assessment and learning should be really all about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was great meeting with you today.
Same.